Welcome to my online Bible study. If this is your first time with me, I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to teach some biblical lessons that you might not be able to get at your normal Bible studies. Here I try to offer what I consider sometimes very thoughtful lessons for the purpose of improving faith and inspiring you into a deeper walk with God. So first of all, I just want to let you know that this lesson today is not an original idea with me, but it's something that I learned from the famous Danish pastor / philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who lived in Denmark around 1850. This idea is not really taught very much today, if at all. We seem to be more concerned with feeling good and with our feelings of God, that we don't really have much concern about a deeper faith. But Soren had a way of digging deeper into the spirit and the heart of man in order to reveal the depths of his faith as well as ours. So I hope that this lesson affects you in the same way that it affected me. Let's begin by testing our purity of heart. And let's start out by asking ourselves the question, is my heart really pure towards God? What are my true motives for believing in God? And how do we answer such a difficult question? Do we use our feelings to judge, or is this more of a theological test of our doctrines where we need to get all the answers correct? Well, it's neither. Kierkegaard picks up on this theme from the letter of James, which actually modern theologians don't believe it was a letter at all from James, but rather it was a copy of notes from a sermon that was given by James and that was published. But Kierkegaard uses this in his assessment of a pure heart. Now, James doesn't actually use the term a pure heart, but he writes about not being double-minded. And this is the theme that caught the eye of Kierkegaard. And to read directly from the passage, it's in James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. And he says this, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given to him. But let him ask in faith, not wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not the man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways." So this idea of being double-minded actually causes you to vacillate and to waver in your faith. And I want to begin by saying that Kierkegaard here is not judging, and he's not criticizing us for not having a pure heart. But he's really trying to help us to become aware of what we need to do in order to correct some misconceptions that we might have as to what authentic faith is and how we can improve upon it. It's so important that we just don't take our sense of emotions and translate that into faith. Faith is really so much deeper and so much better. Now, this is not to say that there are no feelings and emotions that accompany faith. Of course not. But rather that we can err if we confuse feelings with faith as the cause with the effect. Although they may occur together, they are not the same thing. From James, Kierkegaard comes to the conclusion that in order to have pure faith, we must not be double-minded. And in order to avoid being double-minded, we must will only one thing, according to Kierkegaard, to will only one thing. Having one motive for our faith, or focusing on only one thing. But what does it mean to have one thing, or to will one thing? And what is that one thing that we must will? This is really the goal and the topic of our study today. Today we have so many distractions that are attacking us from every direction, and it's so important that we understand this so that we can safeguard our faith from the intrusion of false and unnecessary information. And this was also relatively true in Kierkegaard's day as well. And since he was one of the first and the only pastors to really emphasize this idea, it made it especially difficult for him as he became ostracized by the social elite because of his ideas. I'd like to suggest that you read about Kierkegaard's life, or if you want, you can watch my video that I made of him called A Short Biography of Soren Kierkegaard, which is found on YouTube. I think that this would better help you to understand his context and to give him the respect that he really is due. I know that most of the time my mind is just swirling from all the things that I have to focus on. So thinking on one thing is really difficult for me. And I have to admit that I do suffer from ADHD. But that doesn't give me any excuse, and it doesn't mean that I ought to ignore it or to discount it, and nor should you. The title of this book that I'm going to use as a reference was written by Soren Kierkegaard, and the name is Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing. But notice here that he uses the word will rather than want. It's not purity of heart is to want one thing. And this is extremely important, and it is not done by accident either. So it's important that we start out by understanding what's the difference between wanting and willing. Well, in my mind, wanting implies a kind of separation between having and not having. You want something simply because you don't have it. But mere wanting does not imply that you're actually making any effort to obtain it either. For instance, wanting to learn how to play the guitar and actually learning to play the guitar are two different things. I want to learn how to play the guitar because I don't know how to play the guitar. And that's what I mean by the separation. According to Kierkegaard, willing implies engaging in the process of acquiring whatever one wants. So this is how Kierkegaard defines it. Wanting is a form of wishing. It's a kind of dreaming or passive state of mind, where willing, on the other hand, is a much more dynamic or an active state of mind. I can want to play the guitar, but that doesn't mean that I even have a guitar. No less am I making any effort to learn it. But to will to play the guitar implies that I probably bought a guitar and I'm taking lessons as well as practicing it. Of course, I may not be very good, but at least I'm taking the necessary steps to be able to play it. In other words, I'm engaged in acquiring this object or this skill. And this is how I interpret Kierkegaard's understanding of the terms. So now that we understand this a little bit, let's continue. So to begin our study, willing one thing means that whatever this one thing is, we must seek after it and pursue it and engage ourselves in an effort of having it or acquiring it. Let's apply this to Kierkegaard's idea of willing one thing. Let's start by understanding what is not willing one thing. Now, I know this may seem backwards here, but this is actually how Kierkegaard approaches the subject in his book. He kind of keeps us in suspense about this one thing until near the end. So what is this one thing that we keep talking about and that we have to will? Is it that we must will not to sin? Or that we must will to obey God's commandments? Or is it something like that? Kierkegaard tells us that the one thing we need to will is the good. And now let me give you a little bit of a clue here. That in the word good, he capitalizes the G in the word good. And you'll find out what this means as we continue in our study, but it is significant. And Kierkegaard's premise here is that man must will the good, and only the good. If it's one thing, it must be only the good. At first you might think that, we're willing only the good, but we're probably not, at least by Kierkegaard's standards. He says that if we will the good and at the same time will something that's not the good, it's not one thing. It's a delusion and it's a deception. It is double-mindedness. For example, you might be willing to do the good, but you might also be willing something else that at the same time conflicts with the good. So let's wonder, why is the good one thing and other things are not? Well, if we were to will pleasure or honor or wealth or power, they might appear to be one thing. But the reason that they're not one thing is because these things are always under alteration. They're constantly changing, and therefore they're not one thing. One thing must remain one thing and not change. About 500 BC, a philosopher named Heraclitus made a profound statement. He said, "You can't step into the same river twice." But his student Cratylus took it one step further, saying, "You cannot step into the same river once." The reason being that everything is always constantly changing. But we'll save that philosophy lesson for another day. I just wanted to give you an idea that even the ancient philosophers saw the importance of realizing change. So you see, pleasure changes from moment to moment. If pleasure doesn't change, it can become boring and can only be renewed by change and variety. And since pleasure can take the form of many different things, and there are many pleasures, it cannot be one thing. And such is also true of honor and wealth and power. They never remain the same. But they change depending upon circumstances. Such goals are not one thing because they are imaginary and they're created by the desires and the definitions of man. But Kierkegaard further tells us that even if you were to will the good, with a small g, even then you might not be willing one thing. Well, let's take a look at what he's talking about here in his reasoning. A man might try to will the good in order to get a reward for doing the good. This is double-mindedness, and it's not one thing, but it's two. You may be willing the good, but you're also willing the reward at the same time. Man becomes focused upon the reward and not just the good. He's not willing the good simply because it's good, but because there's a reward associated with doing it. You know, we might want to be good, but we have an ulterior motive for being good, and that's what makes it double-minded. Man can also will the good out of fear of punishment. Kierkegaard says that if there's anything a man should fear, it's doing wrong. And if he's done wrong, he ought to want to be punished. But that still doesn't mean that he's willing one thing either. His fear of punishment is always in the back of his mind, motivating him to do the right thing, the good, but in order to avoid punishment. Now, the fearful man only desires heaven not for itself and what it is, but because he fears the punishment of hell. Such a man does not do what he wants to do, but he does what he has to do, to spare himself eternal punishment. That's double-mindedness. Again, this isn't to say that he doesn't will the good as well, but that he wills it to avoid eternal punishment and not purely for the good itself. I once had a professor in one of my theology classes who asked the class how many believed in Jesus because of their fear of hell. I think everyone in the class except for me raised their hand, including the professor. Now, I can understand that some believers might have come to Christ through fear of hell, but we're not really speaking here about salvation, but rather how to have a mature faith, how to grow in faith, the perfect faith, perhaps. Perhaps fear can account for the initial faith that we have, but hopefully fear will quickly turn into admiration and love for Christ. And the man who wills the good for the sake of the reward, he's also double-minded and not willing one thing, but maybe two or maybe more. This includes the one who wills the good because he thinks he's specially chosen by God to be his instrument of good. Perhaps you've run across someone like this, but this is actually the motive of pride. Now, there was recently a very popular Christian lecturer who thought that God was rewarding him with worldly pleasure because he was chosen by God to preach, as was displayed by his great intelligence. But this isn't how God works. And this is certainly a dangerous form of double-mindedness. And in the end, it destroyed his life and those around him who trusted in him. The good is one thing, and the victory or the reward is another. This person is not devoted to the good alone, so that he may profit nothing, but that he may profit greatly. He may see both the good and the victory of the good, but it must come through him and through his efforts. He must be at the center of the good for it to be of any benefit to him. In other words, there has to be something in it for him. This is what prevented many Pharisees from true faith. They thought that holiness could only come through their rituals and their practices, which they themselves either created or maintained. So then, how can we will the good and only the good? Is it even possible? Well, I had to do a lot of digging into Kierkegaard in order to discover the essence of what he was trying to say here and how we could accomplish this. The good is defined by Kierkegaard to be God's will. And only by willing God's will can we will one thing. But by willing it, it is the good, and for no other reason. This is probably why Kierkegaard capitalizes the G in good, because this good is truly a divine quality rather than a human quality. Willing God's will is an attitude of surrender to God. And this is different than knowing God's will and then deciding that we're going to do it. This usually involves man's interpretation of God's will, and it's really doing it from mixed motives. We turn God's will into a version of our own will, and then congratulate ourselves when we do it. And asking ourselves, what would Jesus do in this situation? That doesn't help us to do God's will either, but also confuses God's will with our own. How do we really know what Jesus would do anyway? Just keep in mind Jesus' prayer to his Father, where he says, "Not my will, but thine." Well, he seems to be saying that he was looking for another way to bring salvation to mankind rather than to die and suffer on the cross. But in the end, Jesus knew that single-mindedness was to will the good, which meant to will his Father's will. What then is our will good for if it's not good for that? Well, when properly used, our will is a means to submit to God. It's how we die to the self and how we live to Christ. It's not so much how we spiritually live that counts, but rather how well we spiritually die. We submit our will to God's will by willing His will. Perhaps you're going to have to think about this for a while and meditate upon this and maybe watch this video over again a few times, and that's perfectly fine. You can't imagine how many times I had to read this book over and over again before I was able to understand it. As long as we continue to will ourselves to do good, we're not using our will in the manner that God wants us to use it. You see, man can never be good, and he can never will himself to be good. Paul taught this in Romans chapter 7, which you might want to reread at this time. Even Jesus said, only God is good. So we must therefore not will to be good, but simply will the good, which is God's will, which is the only good that exists. I hope that you can see the difference here. When we will ourselves to be good, we always become double-minded. But by willing the good in the form of God's will, we are willing one thing, which is God's goodness. But what is God's will for us that we ought to will? I mean, that's pretty vague, God's will and goodness, right? Do we have maybe a better answer, more specific? Well, yes, we do. The scripture gives us the Sermon on the Mount. And I don't mean interpretations of Jesus' teachings or sermons about the Sermon on the Mount, but actually what Jesus said here. And you may have been told that, well, no one can actually live by this sermon. This was just a symbolic reference to what we should strive for. But this is the human will trying to discourage us so that we don't surrender our will to God. It's kind of like a last effort on our human will to survive. We must approach Jesus' teachings with the hope that we can in fact live by them. Here is where we begin to exercise the spiritual power of hope. That is the gift that God has given to us. My hope is that I can love my enemy and pray for those who persecute me. My hope is that I can turn my other cheek when stricken on the right. My will cannot will such a thing in truth, but I can hope that I can do such a thing. So let's think here. What have we learned? Well, we have to engage ourselves by willing the good, capital G. This means that we have to seek or pursue the good rather than just dream about it and hope that, well, something magical is going to happen to make it so. And we also learned that the good is not something within us, but something within God. Therefore, willing the good is in fact willing God's will. And God's will for us is seen in the Sermon on the Mount. I would recommend that you get a copy of Kierkegaard's Purity of Heart and study it. I don't mean just read it over and say, okay, I read it now. But in order to really understand it, you have to study it. It will open up a new spiritual horizon in regards to your faith and how to make proper use of it. I also have a video where I give an analysis of this book in a more philosophical but Christian philosophical sense, and that can also be found on YouTube, and I'll include that in the link below. So my sincere blessings to you all. Thanks for watching, and God bless.